Officer Ben thought it was just another quiet afternoon patrol at the grocery store. Shoppers moved peacefully through the aisles. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then a little girl in a bright pink sweater suddenly raised her hand in the air. Not to wave, not to grab something from a shelf, but to give a rescue signal. No one around her understood what it meant. Nobody realized she was trapped. Nobody knew the tattooed man holding her hand wasn't her father. She was silently screaming for help. Officer Ben didn't catch the gesture at first, but his K9 partner, Max, did. The German Shepherd froze mid-step, his ears shot forward, his eyes locked onto the girl's trembling hand, and then without warning, he erupted into frantic barking, pulling hard against his leash, as if his life depended on it. "Max, what's gotten into you, boy?" Ben asked, bewildered. Officer Ben tried to calm him down, but Max refused to back down. Something was wrong, desperately wrong. Within seconds, the calm supermarket transformed into a scene of tension, confusion, and raw urgency. What was this little girl desperately trying to say? Why did the police dog understand the signal instantly when no human did? Stay with us, because what the little girl signaled and what the dog uncovered next would reveal a truth so shocking that the entire store fell into stunned silence. Before we begin, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And honestly, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The grocery store felt unusually peaceful that afternoon. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of brightly colored cereal boxes, the gentle clatter of shopping carts, blending with quiet conversations, and the occasional squeak of sneakers on polished tile floors. Families drifted through aisles with half-filled baskets, comparing labels, chatting, moving at the unhurried rhythm of an ordinary day. Nothing about this place suggested that something life-altering was seconds away from unfolding. Officer Ben walked steadily beside his K9 partner, Max, a trained German Shepherd. As part of a routine community patrol, the dog's tail swayed casually, his head turning to take in the familiar sights and sounds of the store. Ben nodded politely at shoppers, his hand resting loosely on Max's leash, his mind already thinking ahead to the rest of their shift. Everything felt normal, safe, predictable. Then Max slowed. His tail stopped mid-swing, his ears shot up, rigid and alert, and his entire body tensed as if he'd caught the scent of something invisible to human senses. Ben felt the shift immediately through the leash. "Max?" he said quietly, glancing down at his partner. The dog wasn't looking at him. Max's eyes were fixed on something at the far end of the aisle, his nostrils flaring, his breathing suddenly deliberate and controlled. Ben followed his gaze and saw them a man with a dark snake tattoo, coiling up his forearm, walking just a bit too stiffly. And beside him, a little girl in a bright pink sweater. She looked small, fragile, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her steps were mechanical, her shoulders hunched, and her eyes, those wide, frightened eyes, were scanning the store as if searching for something. For someone, for anyone who might understand. Max took a step forward, then another. His focus never wavered. Ben tightened his grip on the leash, puzzled by his partner's sudden intensity. The dog had always been sharp, but this was different. This was primal, instinctive. The little girl's gaze swept across the aisle, and then, for just a heartbeat, her eyes locked onto Max's. In that silent moment, something passed between them, a desperate, unspoken plea that only the dog seemed to hear. And then, slowly, deliberately, the girl stopped walking. She lifted her free hand into the air, palm open, fingers straight and trembling. The rescue signal. Ben saw the gesture, but didn't register its meaning. It looked like she was reaching for something, maybe stretching, maybe just fidgeting. But Max knew. His training, his instincts, every fiber of his being recognized what that small, silent hand was saying. And in the next instant, everything changed. Max's low, rumbling growl erupted into a sharp, commanding bark that echoed through the entire store, freezing shoppers in their tracks and shattering the peaceful afternoon into pieces. Ben's eyes swept across the aisle, trying to understand what had triggered Max's sudden alarm. That's when he finally saw them clearly, the man and the girl his partner had been watching so intently. The man looked ordinary enough, at first glance. Mid-30s, wearing a faded gray hoodie and jeans, a canvas shopping bag hanging from one shoulder. But it was the tattoo that caught Ben's attention, a dark snake coiling up his forearm, its scales rendered in sharp detail, its head disappearing beneath his sleeve. The man's face wore a carefully constructed expression of casual normalcy. But Ben had been a cop long enough to recognize when someone was trying too hard. His smile was too tight, his movements too controlled. His eyes kept darting toward the exits, then back to the girl, then scanning the other shoppers with the hyper-awareness of someone who knew he didn't belong. Beside him stood the little girl in the bright pink sweater, Nora. Though Ben didn't know her name yet, he could see everything he needed to know in her posture. She was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with brown hair falling past her shoulders and a worn stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest like a shield. But unlike the carefree children running through other aisles, laughing and begging their parents for candy, this girl moved like a ghost. Her steps were stiff and mechanical, her free hand held firmly in the man's grip, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself disappear. Her eyes told the real story, wide, frightened, and impossibly alert. They moved constantly, sweeping across faces in the crowd, lingering on the bright red exit sign overhead, searching desperately for something or someone who might see what no one else seemed to notice. She wasn't shopping, she wasn't browsing, she was silently pleading, her entire body a rigid portrait of trapped terror that only a trained eye or a trained nose could detect. Max felt it before Ben could fully process it. The German Shepherd's body had gone completely rigid, every muscle coiled tight, his focus laser-sharp on the little girl. It wasn't just visual. Dogs didn't see fear the way humans did. They smelled it, tasted it in the air like a chemical signature that screamed danger. And right now, Nora was radiating pure, concentrated terror. Max took another step forward, his breathing deliberate, his eyes never leaving the girl. Ben felt the leash pull taut in his hand. "Easy, boy," he murmured. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. Max didn't react to random strangers. He'd been trained to detect threats, to sense danger that humans missed. And right now, every fiber of the dog's being was locked onto this little girl, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. The man noticed them watching. His manufactured smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, and his grip on Nora's hand visibly tightened. Max let out a low, serious huff, a sound Ben had only heard a handful of times in their 3 years together. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was something deeper, more deliberate, a rumbling exhale that carried weight and warning. The dog's entire body remained locked in place, his eyes fixed on Nora with an intensity that made Ben's pulse quicken. "Max, what is it?" Ben asked quietly, keeping his voice steady even as unease crept up his spine. Max had alerted to concealed weapons, tracked missing persons through impossible terrain, and sensed danger that no human eye could detect. But this felt different, more urgent, more personal. Ben's training kicked in automatically. Maintain protocol. Don't escalate without cause. He gave a gentle tug on the leash and issued the command he'd given 1,000 times before. "Heel, Max, heel." Max didn't move. The German Shepherd's ears remained forward, his paws planted firmly on the polished floor, his breathing controlled but insistent. It was open defiance, something Max never did. Ben felt a flash of confusion mixed with concern. "Max, I said heel," he repeated, more firmly this time, adding pressure to the leash. Still nothing. Max's gaze never wavered from the little girl. His tail hung low and motionless, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. Whatever he was sensing, whatever invisible thread connected him to that child, it was stronger than any command Ben could give. Instinct had overridden training, and that fact alone sent a chill through Ben's chest. The man with the snake tattoo was moving now, trying to guide Nora past them toward the checkout lanes. His movements were casual, on the surface, but Ben noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the subtle increase in his pace. He was trying to leave. Quickly, and that's when it happened. Nora's eyes found Max's. The connection was instant, electric, and desperate. The little girl stopped mid-step, forcing the man to halt beside her. Her wide, frightened eyes locked onto the German Shepherd's dark, steady gaze. And in that silent exchange, Ben saw something that made his throat tighten. It wasn't just fear in her expression, it was hope. Raw, trembling, desperate hope that someone, anyone, would finally understand what she couldn't say out loud. Her lips didn't move. She didn't make a sound. But her eyes spoke volumes, unblinking and pleading, pouring every ounce of her terror and desperation into that single look. She was trying to communicate across species, across the crowded aisle, across the impossible barrier of her silence. And Max, with the ancient wisdom that lived in the bones of every working dog, understood perfectly. The dog's body shifted forward, almost imperceptibly, his weight redistributing as if preparing for action. A low, protective rumble built deep in his chest. "Come on, sweetheart," the man said suddenly, his voice too loud, too cheerful. His hand tightened on Nora's wrist, trying to pull her away from the officer and his dog. But Max took a single, determined step forward, and the leash went completely taut in Ben's hand. Nora stopped walking. It wasn't a gradual pause or a casual hesitation. She simply planted her feet and refused to move, even as the man's hand tugged insistently at her wrist. Her stuffed rabbit hung loose in her grip, forgotten, as every ounce of her focus narrowed to a single, desperate action. Slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of the world rested on the movement, Nora lifted her free hand into the air. Palm open, fingers straight, thumb tucked against her palm. The gesture was precise, unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A silent distress signal taught in schools, shared in safety programs, designed for exactly this moment when a child's voice had been stolen by fear or threat. The "help me" signal. Ben saw it. His eyes tracked the small hand, rising above the little girl's head. The trembling fingers stretched toward the fluorescent lights. But his mind didn't make the connection. To him, it looked like she was reaching for something on a high shelf, or maybe stretching, or simply being a restless child. The meaning slipped past him, invisible in its simplicity. But Max knew. The German Shepherd's entire body went rigid. His ears shot forward so sharply they nearly touched. His eyes locked onto that raised hand with absolute certainty, and something deep inside him, part training, part primal protective instinct, part something older than either, erupted to the surface. Every lesson from his K9 academy, every drill on recognizing distress signals, every instinct bred into his bloodline for generations collided in that single moment of recognition. This child was in danger. This child was begging for help. This child needed him now. Max's chest expanded with a deep, powerful breath. And then he barked. Not the playful bark of a dog at the park, not the warning bark of a guard dog at a fence. This was a full-throated, urgent, commanding bark that exploded through the grocery store like a gunshot. The sound cut through conversations, shattered the peaceful atmosphere, and froze every person in the aisle mid-motion. Shopping carts stopped rolling. Hands paused on products. Heads whipped around to locate the source of the alarm. The bark echoed off the walls, sharp and insistent, carrying with it an unmistakable message. Emergency. Danger. Act now. Ben's heart slammed against his ribs. "Max!" he shouted, shocked by the sudden intensity, but the dog wasn't listening. Max barked again, even louder, his body straining forward against the leash with enough force that Ben had to brace himself to keep from being pulled forward. The man with the snake tattoo flinched violently, his casual mask shattering completely. His face went pale, his eyes darted wildly between the dog, the officer, and the nearest exit. Panic flickered across his features, raw and unmistakable. Nora's hand remained raised, trembling in the air, her eyes now brimming with tears as she stared at Max. The dog had heard her. The dog had understood. After hours of silence, of terror, of being invisible, someone finally saw her. Ben's training finally caught up to his instincts. His hand moved to his radio as his eyes snapped between the barking dog, the frozen girl, and the increasingly desperate-looking man. "Everything okay here?" Ben called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority even as his mind raced to piece together what Max already knew. The man stiffened at Ben's question, his whole body going rigid as if he'd been struck. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words that wouldn't come. Then, forcing his features into something resembling a smile, he let out a laugh, high-pitched, shaky, and utterly unconvincing. "Oh, yeah, everything's fine, officer," he said, the words tumbling out too quickly. Just shopping with my daughter here. Your dog startled us, that's all." His free hand came up in a placating gesture. But Ben noticed the tremor in his fingers, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the air-conditioned store. The word daughter hung in the air like a lie waiting to be exposed. Max didn't give him the chance to say more. The German Shepherd lunged forward with sudden, explosive force, his powerful legs driving him toward Nora. Ben felt the leash rip through his grip as 80 pounds of trained muscle surged forward. For a split second, Ben thought Max was attacking, but then he saw what the dog was actually doing. Max planted himself directly between Nora and the man, his body forming an unmistakable shield. His stance was wide and protective, his head lowered, his eyes locked on the man with the snake tattoo. The message was crystal clear. "You will not take her. You will not move her. You will not touch her." Ben quickly grabbed the leash again, but made no move to pull Max back. His own instincts were finally catching fire, every alarm bell in his mind, now screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Ben said, his tone shifting from casual inquiry to official command. His hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing the radio clip there. The man's forced smile collapsed entirely. His face flushed red, then drained to a sickly pale. We don't have time for this," he stammered, and his grip on Nora's wrist tightened visibly. His knuckles went white as he yanked her raised hand down with enough force to make her gasp. That's when Nora moved. She twisted slightly toward Ben, her body angling away from the man as much as his grip would allow. Her eyes, those desperate, pleading eyes, found the officer's face, and she leaned forward just enough that her voice could carry across the small space between them. "He's not my dad." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, fragile and terrified, but they hit Ben like a physical blow. 4 simple words that changed everything. 4 words that transformed a suspicious encounter into a confirmed emergency. The man's face twisted with fury and panic. "She's confused," he said quickly, his voice rising. "She gets like this sometimes. Doesn't know what she's saying." But Ben wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were on Nora, taking in the tear tracks on her cheeks, the white-knuckled grip the man had on her wrist, the way she was leaning toward Max as if the dog were her only lifeline in a drowning sea. And Max, still positioned between them, growled a low, continuous rumble that vibrated through the entire aisle like distant thunder. Ben's hand closed around his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at Miller's Grocery, aisle 7. Possible child abduction in progress." The man opened his mouth to protest, to spin another lie, to conjure some explanation that might salvage the crumbling fiction he'd built. But Max's growl deepened, rising from somewhere primal and ancient, a sound that cut through the air like a blade and silenced every word before it could form. The German Shepherd's lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth. His entire body coiled with barely restrained aggression. The message was unmistakable. One more word, one more move, and I will end this. The man's mouth snapped shut. His eyes darted between the dog, the officer, and the growing crowd of shoppers who had begun to gather at the edges of the aisle, drawn by Max's earlier barking and the palpable tension now saturating the space. Ben kept his position, one hand on his radio, the other ready to move if the situation escalated. His eyes swept the crowd, taking in the confused faces, the phones being pulled out, the whispers beginning to ripple through the assembled strangers. And then one voice cut through the murmuring, a woman's voice, sharp with recognition and horror. "Oh my God! That girl's on the Amber Alert." The words hit like a detonation. Heads whipped toward the speaker, a middle-aged woman in a blue cardigan, her phone clutched in her trembling hand, her face pale as she stared at Nora. "I saw it this morning," she continued, her voice rising with urgency. "That's her. That's the missing girl from the Alert. Nora, something Nora Parker." The crowd's energy shifted instantly. Confusion transformed into alarm. More phones came out, screens glowing as people pulled up news alerts and emergency notifications. Voices overlapped, confirming, exclaiming, pointing. The anonymous little girl in the pink sweater suddenly had a name, a story, a desperate family searching for her. "That's her," another shopper confirmed, holding up their phone to show the Amber Alert notification. "Same sweater, same face. She's been missing since yesterday morning." The man's facade didn't just crack, it shattered completely. The carefully constructed mask of normalcy disintegrated, replaced by raw, animal terror. His face went from pale to ashen, his eyes wild and darting like a cornered predator realizing the trap had closed. Sweat poured down his temples. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest heaving as panic seized control of his body. "No, you don't understand," he started. But his voice cracked. The words, meaningless noise tumbling from lips that could no longer form coherent lies. Ben stepped forward, his hand moving to his belt. "Sir, let go of the girl. Now." But the man wasn't listening anymore. The weight of exposure, of dozens of eyes and phones trained on him, of his crime laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light, had triggered something desperate and dangerous. His grip on Nora's wrist became vicious, yanking her toward him as his eyes locked onto the exit sign, glowing red at the end of the aisle. He was going to run. Max saw it before Ben did. The dog's body tensed, muscles bunching, his growl rising to a fierce bark of warning. And then, in one explosive motion, the man bolted, dragging Nora with him. The man's sudden movement was pure desperation, a violent yank on Nora's arm that nearly lifted her off her feet as he spun toward the exit and ran. His sneakers squealed against the polished floor, his free arm pumping as he dragged the little girl behind him like a rag doll. Nora's stuffed rabbit fell from her grip, hitting the ground as she stumbled, her small legs struggling to keep up with the man's frantic pace. "Stop! Police!" Ben shouted, his voice booming through the store as he broke into a run. But Max was already moving. The German Shepherd exploded forward like a bullet from a gun, his powerful hindquarters launching him into a sprint that defied his size. The leash ripped from Ben's hand completely as 80 pounds of trained muscle and pure instinct tore across the grocery store floor at inhuman speed. His paws barely touched the ground, his body a blur of brown and black fur, as he closed the distance between himself and the fleeing abductor with terrifying efficiency. Shoppers scattered, pressing themselves against shelves and displays as the chase erupted through the store. Shopping carts were abandoned mid-aisle. Items tumbled from hands, gasps and shouts filled the air. Max didn't slow, didn't hesitate. He wove through the obstacles with the precision of a guided missile, his eyes locked on his target, his focus absolute. The man reached the main thoroughfare of the store, the wide space between checkout lanes and the entrance. The automatic doors were just 30 feet away, sliding open as other customers entered, offering a clear path to freedom. He glanced back, saw the dog closing in, and his terror spiked higher. He yanked Nora harder, trying to gain speed, but the little girl was deadweight now, her feet barely keeping contact with the floor. Max was 15 feet behind, then 10, then 5. The dog's breathing was controlled, rhythmic, his training and instinct working in perfect harmony. He calculated angles, predicted movement, measured distance with the tactical precision bred into working canine seconds. The man was heading for the doors in a straight line, pulling Nora with him, his panic making him predictable. That's when Max made his move. Instead of pursuing from directly behind, the German Shepherd suddenly cut sideways in one explosive leap, his trajectory arcing across the man's path like a missile cutting off an escape route. His body twisted midair, powerful legs extending, and he landed perfectly positioned 3 feet ahead of the running man, directly between him and the exit. The man saw the wall of fur and muscle materialize in front of him too late. His eyes went wide with shock. He tried to stop, his sneakers skidding on the polished floor, his arms windmilling as momentum carried him forward. But physics and panic worked against him. His feet slid out from under him, his balance shattered, and he stumbled violently, still gripping Nora's wrist, but no longer in control of anything. Max planted himself like an immovable barrier, his body low and ready, his teeth bared, a continuous growl rumbling from his chest that promised violence if the man took one more step toward those doors. The man's forward momentum died completely, his desperate run reduced to a clumsy, off-balance stagger as he fought to stay upright. Max didn't wait for the man to regain his footing. The German Shepherd surged forward with one final, commanding bark, a sound so powerful, so filled with authority and fury, that it seemed to shake the very air around them. The bark wasn't just noise, it was a weapon, a force that struck the man like a physical blow. Already off balance, already teetering on the edge of collapse, the man's body reacted instinctively to the explosive sound. His legs buckled, his grip on Nora's wrist loosened as his arms flew out to catch himself. And in that single moment of lost control, gravity took over. The man went down hard, his knees hitting the floor first, then his hands, his body crumpling as the last of his strength and composure abandoned him. His fingers released Nora's wrist completely, and the little girl stumbled backward, free for the first time in hours. Ben was there in an instant. His arms caught Nora before she could fall, scooping her up and pulling her against his chest as he dropped to one knee. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're safe now. I've got you." Nora clung to him, her small hands gripping his uniform, her body trembling with shock and exhaustion and overwhelming relief. She didn't cry, didn't speak, she simply held on, as if letting go might mean falling back into the nightmare she'd just escaped. Max moved with lethal precision. Before the man could even think about getting back up, before he could consider running or fighting or doing anything but surrendering, the German Shepherd was on him. Max planted his front paws on the man's back, forcing him flat against the floor, his full weight pressing down with uncompromising force. The dog's face hovered inches from the back of the man's head, teeth bared, a continuous, fierce growl, rumbling from deep in his chest that promised instant and brutal consequences if the man so much as twitched. "Don't move," Ben commanded, still holding Nora with one arm while his free hand moved to his belt. "Don't even breathe wrong." The man didn't move. He couldn't. Between Max's weight and the complete collapse of his will, he simply lay there, his face pressed against the cold floor, his body shaking with the realization that it was over. The desperate gamble had failed. The chase had ended. He was caught. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The automatic doors slid open, and 3 uniformed officers rushed in, hands on their weapons, eyes scanning for the threat. Ben nodded toward the man pinned beneath his canine partner. "Suspect is secured," Ben said. "Get him cuffed." 2 officers moved in, pulling handcuffs from their belts. Max held his position until Ben gave the command. "Max, release." The German Shepherd stepped back, but only barely, his eyes never leaving the man as the officers hauled him roughly to his feet and secured his wrists behind his back. Max's growl continued, low and menacing, a final warning that, even in custody, even surrounded by officers, the man would answer to the dog if he made one wrong move. "You're done," one of the officers said flatly, reading the man his rights as they began walking him toward the waiting patrol cars outside. Ben stood slowly, still holding Nora, and looked down at Max. The dog's tail gave a single, satisfied thump against the floor. Ben felt Nora shift in his arms, her small body turning, reaching. Her eyes weren't on him anymore, they were fixed on Max, standing just a few feet away, his chest still heaving from the chase. His dark eyes locked on her with that same protective intensity that had never wavered. "Can I?" Nora's voice came out as barely a whisper, fragile and uncertain. "Can I go to him?" Ben's throat tightened. He nodded, lowering her gently to the ground. The moment her feet touched the floor, Nora moved not away from the danger she'd just escaped, but toward the dog who had saved her. She dropped to her knees in front of Max, and without hesitation, without fear, she wrapped her small arms around his neck and buried her face in his thick fur. Her fingers clutched at his coat, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in a world that had tried to tear her apart. Max stood perfectly still, his body a warm, unmoving anchor, letting her cling to him as tightly as she needed. And then the sobs came. Not the quiet, suppressed tears of a child trying to stay invisible. These were deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, the release of hours of terror, of silence, of holding everything inside, because screaming would have made it worse. She cried into Max's fur, and the dog simply stood there, accepting the weight of her grief and fear and relief, without judgment, without movement, just steady and present and safe. I learned it in school. Nora choked out between sobs, her voice muffled against Max's neck. The hand signal. They taught us in the safety assembly. He said if I screamed, he'd hurt me. He said no one would believe me anyway. Her small hands tightened in Max's fur, but I remembered the signal. I remembered, and I thought maybe someone would see, maybe someone would know. Ben crouched down beside them, his own eyes stinging. "You were so brave, Nora," he said quietly. "So incredibly brave." "He saw it," Nora whispered, pulling back just enough to look at Max's face. "He understood. I didn't think anyone would, but he did." Max responded with a soft exhale through his nose and lowered his head slightly, letting Nora press her forehead against his. For a moment, there was only the two of them, the little girl and the dog who had heard her silent scream. Then the doors burst open again. "Nora." The voice was raw with desperation and hope and disbelief, all tangled together. A woman came running through the entrance, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild as they searched the crowd. Another officer tried to slow her down, but she pushed past, driven by the primal need to reach her child. "Nora! Nora!" Nora's head snapped up. "Mama?" Her voice cracked on the word, and then she was scrambling to her feet, releasing Max, turning toward the sound. "Mama!" The woman saw her. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze as mother and daughter locked eyes across the store. And then they were running toward each other, closing the distance that had felt infinite just hours ago. They collided in an embrace that looked like it might never end. Nora's mother held her daughter like she was made of something precious and fragile, her hands running over Nora's hair, her back, her arms checking, confirming, making sure this was real. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered her daughter's name over and over like a prayer finally answered. "You're here. You're safe. Oh God, you're safe." For a long moment, Nora melted into that embrace, letting her mother's love wrap around her like a shield. But then, gradually, she began to pull back, not away from her mother, but toward something else, someone else. Her mother felt the shift and loosened her grip, confused. "Nora?" But Nora wasn't looking at her. The little girl's eyes had found Max again, standing a few feet away beside Ben, watching the reunion with that same calm, steady presence that had never faltered. His tail swayed once, slowly, and his dark eyes met hers with an understanding that transcended words. Nora slipped from her mother's arms and walked back toward the German shepherd. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, as if pulled by an invisible thread connecting her heart to his. When she reached him, she dropped to her knees on the hard floor, and without hesitation, wrapped her small arms around Max's neck once more. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Her face pressed against his fur, and she held him tighter. "When no one else could hear me, you came for me." Max stood perfectly still, his breathing steady and calm, letting her hold him for as long as she needed. His head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, to let her know he was listening, that he understood. Nora pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Her small hands came up to cup his face, her thumbs brushing over the soft fur of his cheeks. Tears still streamed down her face, but they were different now, not tears of terror or relief, but of gratitude so deep it seemed to overflow from somewhere ancient inside her. "You're my hero," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Max's dark eyes held hers for a long moment, and then he responded the only way he could, with a soft, gentle exhale through his nose and a single, decisive thump of his tail against the floor. It was enough. It was everything. His mission was complete. The child was safe. The threat was neutralized. He had done what he was born to do, what he was trained to do, what every fiber of his being had compelled him to do from the moment he'd sensed her fear in that crowded aisle. Ben crouched down beside them, his hand resting on Max's shoulder. "Good boy," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "The best boy." Nora's mother came to kneel beside her daughter, one hand on Nora's back, the other reaching out to gently stroke Max's head. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." Max's tail thumped again, and for just a moment, in the middle of that grocery store, with sirens still echoing outside, and shoppers still watching in stunned silence, there was peace. There was completion. There was a little girl safe in the presence of the hero who had heard her when no one else could. And Max, the German shepherd who had never stopped listening, simply stood there, steady, strong, and exactly where he was meant to be. If you liked this video and want to see more just like it, then make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far these incredible stories reach.